Hello again. I did say in one of my earlier videos that I wasn't going to be doing routine post-processing because the basic post-processing was pretty much all following the same adjustments. But I decided I would do this one because it's going to demonstrate how to merge bracketed photos, also how to edit in Photoshop where we're going to focus stack. You might have seen in my last video, I was down at the beach with my new Tokina 11 to 16 millimeter wide angle lens. Now the great thing about this lens is, particularly when you get low to the ground, it gives you some quite striking results. Frankly, for a cheap 200 quid lens, I'm really pleased with the results. So what I've got here, I've been through my SD card and I've pulled out 3 sets of brackets of 3. So what we've got is 9 images. Each of the rows here, so images 1 to 3 for example, these are the bracketed sequence where the foreground is focused. The next row is the bracketed sequence where the midground is focused, and the last set are the horizon. The first thing I'm going to do is to merge each of these sets into a HDR. Now normally with bracketing what you would do is you would combine the 3 exposures in Photoshop, where the darker exposure here would be for the sky and the lighter exposure would be for the foreground. I do want all of the dynamic information, so what I'm going to do is use Lightroom to merge these 3 into an HDR. Don't panic, I'm not going to make it look ludicrous with lots of saturation later on. It's simply so that I've got the dynamic range to work with before I focus stack. So the first thing to do is to photo merge HDR, and it's going to bring me up a preview of that in this dialog box. You'll see in the settings I've got auto align checked. I've also got low deghosting. What deghosting does is it tries to combine areas which may have moved slightly between the exposures. The problem you have is if you use a high amount of deghosting is you can lose sharpness. I've got the overlay show checked here. Doesn't seem to be any ghosting, so that's good. So we'll just merge those. You'll see up here it's showing that as merging, and that goes on in the background. You don't have to wait for that to finish merging before you go on to the next one. So we'll just merge these. I'll probably just pause the video while I do all this to save you losing the will to live. Okay, so we've now got 3 new merged images which contain all the dynamic range from each of these sets of 3. What we're going to do is we're going to develop one of them, and then we'll just a bit of basic adjustments, and then we'll synchronize those across the 3 composites, and then we'll take them out to Photoshop to do the stacking. So first things first, use my standard preset. We need to sort out the white balance. Here's a tip for you. Good way of sorting out white balance and tint is to crank up vibrance and saturation as far as they'll go, and then adjust your white balance so that you've got about half and half blue and yellow, and the same goes for the tint so that it's sitting just in between, and that's perfect. Double click the labels and that'll bring these back to 0. So we've sorted out white balance and tint. Next thing to do is to just want to set the horizon. What you do is you select this little level tool, click and drag a line out along what you want to be horizontal, and there you go. It's as easy as that. I used to spend hours trying to rotate the picture manually and line it up with grid lines. What an amateur. Okay, so we need to bring the highlights down and recover some of the shadows up. We want to get our white point and our black point dialed in. That's that done. going to give it quite a bit of vibrance, but I'll compensate a wee bit just by pulling the overall saturation down a little, and I want the exposure up just a little bit. I'm going to put a filter here, and we don't want to come down 2 stops. I think coming down a stop will do it. And what I also want to do, if I click on new, I'm going to put another filter, a graduated filter, down this bottom half. But with this one I want to come up a stop, and I want this to be slightly more gradual. Something like that. So we get a much better overall balance. Now this still all looks a bit flat, so we do want some clarity and contrast. What I also want to do with the filter for the sky is dehaze it just ever so slightly. Just create some definition in those clouds. Now what I also want to do is I just want, let's have a look, a brush adjustment minus a stop. Just want to tone down the brightness on the beach there where there's reflections. That's better. Just take the edge off it slightly. Keeps the colour, but just stops it being so in your face. Okay, so those are all the basic adjustments done. I'm going to put in a little bit of noise reduction. Not much. Not worried about sharpening. Lightroom automatically adds 25 sharpening. I'm going to leave it at that because I do the bulk of my sharpening in Photoshop. So now I just want to play with the colours, because I'm just going to shift the hue slightly over to the red, not much at all, just dial in a little bit. That's much more like how it was when I was taking it, and kind of do contrasting saturation adjustment. Not too much. I want to make it as accurate as I can to how I saw it, but at the same time give it just a little bit more punch. I'm going to leave the luminance settings as they are. I'm quite happy with that. And I think that's pretty much it, apart from just bringing up the overall exposure a little bit. That's better. So I'm happy with that. So we go back to our grid. You can see this one's all been adjusted. So what I'm going to do now, shift click on here to highlight those, sync settings, everything's checked, so I'm going to synchronize those. There we are. Okay, so these 3 images are now ready to be edited in Photoshop. So we're going to right click, go down to editing, and I want them opened as layers in Photoshop. All 3 layers are open in Photoshop. The first thing I need to do is to go to auto align layers. They're pretty close, but pays just to let Photoshop tidy it up a little bit, and there you can see it's put a bit of an edge around it, which shows how it's adjusted slightly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to crop in about there. Okay, that's good. Right, so the next thing we need to do is to focus stack. So again, we go to edit, auto blend layers this time, stack images, seamless tones and colors, okay. What Photoshop is now doing is creating a layer mask for each of these layers, which will mask out anything on each layer which isn't perfectly sharp. And you end up with a composite image where everything is really crispy right from the front right up to the horizon. Simple as that, nothing to it. And you can see if you look over here that each mask is masking out different areas of the image. So with that all done, I'm going to do a few more adjustments in Photoshop and then go back into Lightroom to finish it up a little bit further. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a composite layer by Shift Alt Command E. What this does is it creates a layer from these. I don't like merging layers or flattening them down, because if I ever want to come back and do something, I can't. So I would rather take a snapshot layer of what we've done so far and work with that, and you'll see as we go on I put adjustment layers on. I won't be flattening it down at any point. So with this layer we're going to make it black and white, Shift Alt Control B, OK, and then I'm going to apply a high pass filter and 3 pixels, yep, that'll do nicely. We'll OK that and make the blend mode overlay, and I doubt if you can see that on the video, but it's just sharpened it up nicely, especially the highlights on all these little pebbles on the beach. So very happy with that. Next thing I'm going to do is, before I do that, I'll just label that layer. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an Orton effect. You may have heard of this, and I use a really simple way of doing it. The effect is where you kind of get that dreamy glow on an image. The way I'm showing you how to do this, you don't lose sharpness, but it just creates a sort of hazy glow, which works nicely with this kind of image. So again, I want a composite of my focus stack layers. So we'll create another composite layer, and with this layer we're going to blur it using a Gaussian blur. And for the Orton effect, you tend to want your radius, general rule of thumb, I tend to use a radius that's in the region of the focal length of the image. Well, I was using I think 12mm, but we'll set the radius at 20 and turn off that sharpening layer just for now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to adjust this with an exposure adjustment, but I'm not doing it as an adjustment layer, because even though this is what you could call a destructive change, when we've blended the layer you'll see that it's a very sort of minimal effect. Come down to, tend to start at about 30%. Yeah, that's nice. If I switch that off, you see all it's done is just given it that sort of hazy, dreamy feel to it. It doesn't work on every picture, but I just felt on this one it would just give it a little bit more atmosphere. Because as you might have seen from the previous video, it was literally just 10 minutes on the beach, quick photograph, try out a new lens. So my subject isn't that interesting, so this is a mechanism to make it a bit more interesting. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a curves adjustment layer on, and you'll see, having done that, it gives me a layer mask automatically. And what I'm going to do with a layer mask selected is I'm going to use apply image, and what that's going to do is mean that I'm now really only targeting the highlighted areas. If I show you that layer mask, you can see actually there's quite a lot of midtones in there. In fact, I think what I'll do is I'll do apply image again, and that darkens it down. You can see now a lot of the image won't be affected, but certain areas will be, and you'll see why I want to do that now. If I go back to my curves adjustment, I only want the red channel for this adjustment, and I'm just going to pull the reds up on that curve, pull it back down there. And what that's doing is it's only affecting the highlights, just giving them a slightly red tint. I'm happy with that, that's good. Okay, and then finally I just want to put a photo filter on. Don't use these very often, but on a sunset they can be quite good. We'll pull the sharpen layer up to the top. Now with this photo filter, I don't want the effect on the sky, because what it's doing is making this sky area up here look slightly washed out. It's basically neutralizing the color of the sky because it's the sort of opposite end of the color wheel. So I've got the mask selected on that photo filter, get a black brush, nice big black brush, and just take the effect off just in that very upper portion of the sky. Good. Okay. Right, I'm really happy with that. So all I need to do, Command S to save it. Come out of Photoshop, we go back into Lightroom, and there it is in Lightroom. Tell a lie, there it is in Lightroom. Lightroom has a habit of shunting the pictures around in the grid if you're not careful. You can end up working on the wrong one. So this is our picture that's come back from Photoshop, and just a tiny bit of development to finish it off. I'm just going to bring the exposure up a tiny little bit, and the reason for that is that my monitor calibration is a little bit dark. I really should calibrate it properly when I get a minute. But if I sent it out for printing without that third of a stop exposure adjustment, it would be quite a bit darker than it appears to me on my monitor. And finally, my favourite little finishing touch is a slight vignette, and feather it back out. Perfect. So there you have it. One little tip: you're going to put your pictures on Facebook. You might know that Facebook's image compression algorithm is horrendous. All the work I've just done will be utterly ruined by Facebook. So the best way to preserve it as close as you can to what you've created with your images, make sure that the longest side is no bigger than 2048 pixels, and save it as a PNG file, because they do a lot less processing on PNGs, and I found that they look much more accurate to what you created once they've been buggered about by Facebook. So that's it for this post-processing. I hope you found it useful. We've covered bracketing, merging to HDR in Lightroom, exporting out of Lightroom, focus stacking, auto-aligning back into Lightroom, and a little bit of finishing off. So hope you found it useful, and join me next time where God knows where I'll be. Thanks a lot.